Christopher Hitchens believes that religion is the enemy of culture in all phases, and our other two panelists are sort of ambivalent or of a middle-level position. But again, Jonathan, is it possible for culture and religion to be reconciled? That's why I asked you earlier that absent the book of Revelation, would that be something we could all aspire to?
You know, I was reminded of a trip my wife Ann and I took to Paris. We saw the Pantheon, which was a church that was desacralized after the French Revolution. It is a sterile church. You can go to Notre Dame or Sacré-Cœur, which are old medieval churches, and they're very beautiful places. We go into our art museums and we see statues that we praise as the highest art of the classical world. Their original purpose was as what our Bible calls idols. This is our culture. Religion is our culture. It provides the stuff of our culture. And to repudiate that cultural legacy is precisely the same as the Taliban going out and dynamiting Buddhist statues in Afghanistan. It's vandalism.
Silly point. Very, very silly point. Extremely silly point.
All right, with that, you know, you've never really seen Christopher Hitchens that articulate. Silly point. All that British breeding came to that. Silly.
Jolly silly point.
Jolly silly point.
Very foolish observation.
Monty Python-esque.
Sacré-Cœur, by the way, was built in the late 19th century. It's not medieval at all. It was built to celebrate the defeat of republicanism in France. It expresses the sectarianism of the French Catholic Church.
Indeed, but
its historical alignment with the anti-Semites, the army, and the elite.
I do believe
you can worship there if you like. And that's the
now we're
you
bickering.
find.
Now we're bickering.
All right.
I do believe Notre Dame is a medieval cathedral.
Yes, around which Thomas Aquinas once flew, you may be interested to know. He levitated all around. We have the witnesses. After leaving one of his books on the high altar to be reviewed by God and receiving, by channeling a favorable review, he flew in delight around the nave of Notre Dame. You can check it out. And many people think that's culture.
Christopher, I warned you I was here to protect Jonathan.
Okay.
We continue now. Republican strategist Ralph Reed and columnist and author Christopher Hitchens. You know, Christopher, I interviewed you a little bit about your book just a short time ago. And it made me think a lot. Jerry Falwell, because I do know him, he does a lot for people that are in trouble. He gave a lot of scholarships to his school. He helped women that were pregnant and needed help. He'd give them food and a place to live and an education. He did a lot to people that are alcoholics and et cetera, et cetera. You have your hostility towards religion, and that's without saying. You know, I just wonder, you know, when you compare his life, you know, there are a lot of good atheist communists out there like Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot, and you know, they slaughtered millions. Jerry Falwell slaughtered nobody in his life. He may have misspoke once or twice, but he devoted his life to his religion. You have nothing good to say about him at all?
No, I repeat, Jerry Falwell lived on hatred and superstition and bigotry. He preached dislike of people whose lives he knew nothing about. He raised money from credulous fools.
You don't know anything about his life.
Now, excuse me, sir. You can either ask me on and ask my opinion, or you may not. But I don't have to be here if you're going to take that attitude.
Well, you could leave.
You spent the first half by saying I had no right to the opinion you'd asked me on to express. Now you're tiring me out. I repeat, though.
No, what I said is your opinion was thoughtless. What you wrote was crude and mean and hateful. That's what I said.
You took up all the time for my answer with your long, rather unlettered question.
Oh, okay.
Jerry Falwell made a career out of sponsoring dislike and superstition, said that people he didn't like were going to hell, said the United States deserved to be attacked by Islamic fascists, said he believed that people would be raptured into heaven, leaving all the rest of us to wallow behind. I think his death is a deliverance. And if you say that someone who occasionally makes a charitable donation is a good person, then you have to say that Hamas and Hezbollah, who do all this charitable giving and charitable organizing, are the same.
In a country that celebrates it, Ralph Reed.
Sean, you know, look,
and why not a word now from the friend of Jack Abramoff?
Well, we'll have a moment here, Ralph. Here's an important question about. Well, let me get Ralph in here. Here's an important question
about
Jerry Falwell.
That's all it needs now.
Ralph,
let's hear from the Abramoff faction.
We only have a moment left. Ralph gets to speak too.
Rip-off artists. You should be ashamed of yourselves.
Hold on, Christopher. Ralph, the big controversy about Jerry Falwell was he fused religion and politics, and that's what people will be debating, I guess, going forward. And after he said he would not do such a thing, would Jesus have advocated the GOP, and was he right to bring in
What a question.
Marry those two and give that impression. We only have a very short time left, Ralph.
Well, I don't think that's ever what Dr. Falwell said. What he said was that there were certain transcendent values, such as the protection of innocent human life, the sanctity of marriage, the need to defend the state of Israel, his opposition to communism, his opposition to radical
defend the Israeli occupation.
jihadism, and what he believed was that those values should be reflected in public policy. And I think that, you know, when you have a community of Liberty University with its 10,000 students in residence, you have 22,000 members of his church, you have millions of others of people who looked up to him and admired him. I would really hope that people like Christopher would show the decency and respect to let those people mourn and remember his memory without being torn down and attacked.
Tell it to your business partner.
Good try, Christopher.
Tell it to your
personal friend of mine, and I'll miss him. When we come back, Tyler gets too close to a dancing performance.
Tertullian, one of the church fathers, said that one of the great things about being in heaven was you'd be able to watch the writhings and the tortures of those who'd been sent to hell. And I think what I mainly live for is contemplating the misfortunes of other people.
Well, that leads me to a very...
That and vindication, being proved repeatedly and over again right when other people were wrong. That does a lot for me. But raising the sights just a fraction, I'd say that to me that what matters most is the pursuit of happiness, in the words of our greatest founding father, and the pursuit of liberty, freedom. And that these things are incompatible, completely incompatible with the worship of an unalterable celestial dictator. Someone who can watch you while you sleep and convict you of thought crime, and whose rule cannot be challenged, and who's the big brother whose eternal reign may not be disputed. That makes the concept of the pursuit of freedom and happiness completely negative, negates it. So one of the things I live for is to return a stout and joyful non-serviam to this dictator, who I'm pleased to find doesn't really exist, but is instead a creation of those who want to install a theocracy in the real life where I can participate, and I'm not going to give them an inch. The second thing I live for is, if not exactly passing on my genes, taking part in activities that might allow those genes to be passed on. And not scorning the three delightful children who result, who are everything to me and who are my only chance of even a glimpse of a second life, let alone an immortal one. And I'll tell you something, if I was told to sacrifice them to prove my devotion to God, if I was told to do what all monotheists are told to do, and admire the man who said, yes, I'll gut my kid to show my love of God, I'd say, no, fuck you.
Christopher, I would like to start with you. What have you got against God?
Good grief. So it hadn't completely sunk in on me that as you were being ordained, when I was 9, I was just getting out of there completely. It was 9 when I thought I saw through it, when my biology teacher told me that God was so good as to have made vegetation green because it was the color most restful to our eyes. And I thought, Mrs. Watts, this is nonsense. I knew nothing about chlorophyll or photosynthesis, nothing about the theory of evolution, nothing about adaptation, nothing of the sort. I just knew she'd got everything all wrong. And of course the argument against faith, against religion, falls into two essential halves, not necessarily congruent, but I believe congruent. The first is, it's not true. Religion comes from the infancy of our species. I won't say race, because I don't think our species is subdivided by races. Infancy of our species, when we didn't know that the Earth went round the sun. We didn't know that germs caused disease. We didn't know when we were told in Genesis, you're given dominion over all creatures, that this did not include microorganisms, because we didn't know they were there. So you didn't know they had dominion over us. When diseases broke out, it was blamed on wickedness, or sometimes on the Jews. Or if it was by Jews, on the Amalekites, or as you will. We didn't know anything about the nature of the Earth's crust, how it was cooling, earthquakes, storms, all of this were a mystery. Well, we are at least to that extent a reasoning species. Even a conspiracy theory is often better than no theory at all. The mind searches for form. We're now stuck with the forms that we found in our infancy, in our primitive, barbaric
past. Well, that could be fine still. No nation can be without mythology or myth or legend. And there are people who say, well, it's not exactly true. Virgins don't conceive. Okay. Bushes don't burn forever. Although why that would be so impressive, I've never understood. Dead men don't walk, and so on and so on. Okay, it's not really true. It does come from a rather fearful period of the Dark Ages, but at least it's nice to believe it. It teaches good precepts. This, I think, is very radically untrue. I give in my book the example, which I'll give you now, of a person very much influential on my youth, and I know on the Reverend's too, Dr. Martin Luther King. My friend Taylor Branch's book about Dr. King, I would rather call him Doctor than Reverend, because I'm sorry to say I think it's a higher title of honor. Taylor Branch's trilogy about him is called Parting the Waters, The Pillar of Fire, and At Jordan's Edge. And everybody literate here knows the story of Exodus and understands what Dr. King meant when he demanded that his people be free of bondage. But if you think about it for a second, it's a very good thing that the good doctor was only using this metaphorically. If he'd really been invoking the lessons of Genesis and Exodus, he would have been saying that his people had the right to kill anyone who stood in their way, to exterminate all other tribes, to mutilate their children's genitalia, to make slaves of those they captured, to take the land and property of others, to engage in rather long and hideous and elaborate arguments about ox goring, and finally, which is the sentence that ends that, or the verse that ends that section of the book, should not suffer a witch to live, the warrant for witch burning. In other words, in these books, there are the warrants for genocide, for slavery, for the torture of children, for disobedience, for genital mutilation, for annexation, for rape, and all the rest of it. It's a very good thing that this is man-made. There are those who say that they wish they could believe, and I suppose a decent atheist could say that if only for lack of evidence he wishes he or she could. I can't be among their number. I'm very glad it is not true that there is a permanent, unshakable, unchallengeable celestial supervision. We have the tradition that brings us through Galileo and Spinoza and Thomas Paine and Voltaire and Thomas Jefferson and Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, men of great wisdom and insight, by all means struck by the awe-inspiring character of our universe, by all means open to devotional music and architecture and poetry, by all means aware of the transcendent, but look through the Hubble telescope if you want to see something that is awe-inspiring. And don't look to blood-stained old myths. Now, why now? Why am I doing this now, people ask? Well, I'll tell you why now, because in the last few years it's become impossible to turn a page of a newspaper without being, as the religious would say, offended. In other words, I don't think I sound self-pitying if I say that I'm offended that a cartoonist in a tiny democratic country in Scandinavia, Denmark, can't do his job without a death threat, and that no American magazine or newspaper would reprint those cartoons, either to elucidate the question or in solidarity. I'm offended that civil society in Iraq is being destroyed, leveled by the parties of God. I'm offended that people in this country believe that they have the right to advocate the teaching of garbage to children under the fatuous name of intelligent design. I believe that we're... I thought you'd never clap. Just as I believe that where religion ends, philosophy begins, where alchemy ends, chemistry begins, where astrology ends, astronomy begins, and now the people will say, well, let's give equal time to astrology in the schools. It's nonsense, dangerous and sinister nonsense.